Hello.
Marco,
Hello.
how you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. It's winter came and it came pretty hard. I don't know about you, but
It
it's
seems Europe have all been hit. I had a call this morning with someone in, oh God, I can't remember, like maybe Germany sort of way, and they had exactly the same comments that I did. You know, we were actually on the beach. You may have even seen the photo that I shared 2 weeks ago at the weekend. We were sat on a beach. And yeah, this weekend just gone, it was, I don't know, maybe at like sort of more like 5-10 degrees. It was bitterly cold.
yeah, we went from almost 20 degrees in the morning to 4 this morning. So yeah.
So Graphics just shared an issue link. I'm just gonna share my screen so we can at least hopefully talk about it. Oh, this is interesting. Oh, it's a screenshot, right? No, actual code. So don't. Oh, yeah, yeah. So, funnily enough, I vaguely, I feel like I've seen this issue at some point in the past for some reason. Um, I don't know if I've been
Yeah, I
involved.
tried recreating this issue, but mine is I was using the GitLab open source edition, and I don't think I have that the particular feature. Either the feature is getting scoped out, or I don't have access on the enterprise edition. That could be the difference I see. So on my screen, I was able to add the issue, but I couldn't add an link, which is not an issue, to the ticket. If you like, you want me to
So,
rephrase it?
yeah. Maybe you don't have like this section. Is that what you mean, or?
So yeah, I was unable to add an custom URL as a linked item. I can only add an issue.
Yeah, okay. So let me just reread right, okay, this is specific to incidents. So let me just check incidents.
Unless you have to use for example, those were Zoom links. So maybe you have to use the quick action to create a Zoom meeting.
But then it does say resource link. So let's just let me see if my GDK is up and running. Okay, that's not good. I started it quite a while ago and it's throwing some pretty crazy errors.
Did you
So
give up on GCK?
yeah, pretty much. There's still some conversations. We still want to do something.
Yeah,
But I don't know what that is. If it's a VM, if it's GCK, if it's GDK, if it's Docker, if it's yeah, we don't really know the answer to that.
yeah, I know the conversation.
Let me instead go to just trying to think about. We still got our like community coders group. So incidents would be under monitor. So instance, so let's just create an incident. What am I saying? It didn't say some test. Okay, so we've got linked incidents or issues. So we can only.
And you can paste a link.
Okay, I didn't add this particular feature about.
Okay, so should I see if in a free group? Although saying that, I think the license has run out.
Yep.
Yeah, the license has run out, so this should be behaving like. So this hasn't got any premium features at the moment. That being said, this doesn't seem to be the same thing, right? So
No, because when you try to add an URL, you got an error.
yeah. So
Yeah.
what does it say? Is it the same thing or not? Just yeah. So it's linked resources, not linked issues. So let's have a look. Go back to GitLab instance. Linked resources. Aha! So that is a premium feature. So you'll definitely need an enterprise license in order to be able to work on.
Okay.
The best thing, I don't know if you've done this before. Now my Google foo skills are going to fail me. Right. So, okay, here's the process. I'll drop this link into the Discord conversation. So, no, this isn't contributed, or is it?
No, I think.
Here, yeah, this is it. This is it.
Oh, okay.
So it says the first and easiest thing is to sign up for a free trial for 30 days. But
Okay.
after that, or in addition to that, there's an issue template. So there's a link here. If you follow this link and
Sure.
fill out
Okay.
this and create this, that will actually ping my team anyway. I just need to approve that request, and then normally within 24 hours, the relevant team will generate that license. So
Understood.
yes, sign up for a free trial, or fill out that form, or do both, and then you can get an enterprise license, and then you can hopefully see what this kind of how it works in GDK, and yeah, go from there.
Sure.
All right.
I'll do that. Thanks.
Awesome, no worries. Have you got any other questions? So,
No, this was my main agenda
Okay.
here.
okay, that's slightly handy, slightly cheeky from my point of view. I have something that I was interested in looking at. If you're happy to indulge me, so I'll give a little bit of background. We use I believe it's just called a community platform called Common Room. And Common Room is actually connected to our forum. It's connected to Discord. It's connected to Reddit, to Twitter, to all sorts of kind of platforms and socials and other bits and pieces. And the sort of plan, it's still a relatively new platform for us, but the plan is to be able to get a really nice kind of consolidated view of community members. So, you know, we can sort of see not just, oh, like everyone knows Marco is really active sort of thing. Well, actually, yeah, in Discord, but we might have someone that's kind of dipping their toe in on the forum and dipping their toe in here and there, and we can actually see these people. We can start to recognize them, to reward them, to engage with them, those kind of things. But just visibility is really the first thing. So we've got that platform. I built a sort of fairly basic integration with GitLab, because it doesn't have a native out-of-the-box integration with GitLab. So we now have a feed going in, and as always, I've made it a public project, open source within GitLab itself, so you can see the source code. And at the moment, all it really does is uses the GitLab API to get created and merge requests, and issues, and then kind of loop through them and integrate the authors of those issues merge requests using the Common Room API, and then integrate the issues, and then integrate the merge requests. Now you can pretty much see here it's not that smart, not that intelligent, not the cleanest, bestest piece of Ruby code in the world, but it's functional. And there's a fairly select list of fields that we're sending through at the moment. We're not taking comments or emojis, or there's lots of other stuff we're not taking, but I specifically focused on comments and reactions, because they're kind of the two next things that we really want to look at integrating. So the reason that I've done what I've done so far and haven't done anything else is pretty much that issues, merge requests is reasonably straightforward. We can make an API call to say, give me all the issues that were created between these dates in these groups, and give me all the merge requests that were created in these groups between these dates and or merged between these dates. That works well. For comments, it's a little bit, I'm going to go as far as to say it's impossible. We can't make an API call to say, give me all the comments that were added between these dates to these groups. You know, digging deeper, there's a lot of reasons why it's not possible, because comments are actually made on merge requests and issues. Merge requests and issues then belong to projects. Projects then belong to groups. You've then got filter. There's a whole bunch of kind of complexity, and it mainly stems around the database structure. But it's not really foreseeable that we're going to easily be able to resolve that and make it such that we can make an API call and say, give me all the issues, or the comments, sorry, between these dates for these groups. And then even more specifically, we're only interested in community members making comments. We don't care about team members. So there's so many criteria that we just can't really use the API to leverage at the moment. We might try and chip away at that as well in the background and start by saying, oh, can we make an endpoint where we can grab comments within a date range, and then start to kind of filter that down more to say, can we filter where, I don't know, I don't even know how you do it, but let's not dive too much down that route. The easy or simplest possible plausible solution at the moment that we have in mind is to leverage webhooks. And probably go on.
Yeah, integrate with the triage-ops, since
exactly. So we could build something from scratch, but again, we'd then have to think about architecture, infrastructure. Where does it live? How do we host it? Who's paying for it? Lots of other questions. But as you rightly call out, we already have the triage-ops project, which essentially listens to webhooks on the main GitLab groups, GitLab.com and GitLab.org. And it's already there and listening, and we could feasibly add processors to listen for comments by wider community members, and then integrate those almost real time into Common Room. And that sort of takes away this problem of having to query GitLab for this data.
Well, that's already implemented because it's basically how GitLab bot works.
Exactly. So I didn't get very far. I literally just started a few minutes before the call, but I started by copying a random community processor. I think it was a hackathon label. I stripped out most of it. And, I've said I want to listen to merge request notes and issue notes, and I want them to not be from a team member. But I don't care whether the merge request or the issue is open or closed, or, there's lots. Yeah, but basically that's all I'm interested in.
Yep. And you basically have to make the call to the Common Room API now.
Yeah, I mean, we might be might be jumping ahead. That's a fine approach. the other thing we could do is figure out, well, what is it that we actually want to send, and have we got everything, or are we going to need to grab some more information from GitLab? I think we've probably got everything we need.
Well, I mean, Common Room is used to track activity, not what exactly the user is doing. So like what message or what not they left on an issue or on an MR. We only want to know that, okay, this user left 2 notes on an issue today.
Not quite true, actually, because Common Room actually tracks sentiment, if that's the right term. So we will actually, the content of the note is quite important to see, you know, is someone answering questions? Is someone just being negative and derogatory, or is someone being, so yeah, we can actually, the content is reasonably important. That being said, that's definitely in the payload. So like I don't know where to sort of scribble, but what do we want? So we need to know the comment author, and this is again immediately interesting, tricky, whatever you want to call it, because we want all of this information about the author. So I immediately think we're probably going to need to use the GitLab API to get. I'd be surprised if our like webhook payload has got all of this information in. In fact, I'm almost certain of it. We'll have a look if we.
I guess you only have the user ID, maybe username.
Yeah, I think name, username, ID, maybe a couple of other basic bits, but not a lot more. So we look at user.
Yeah, the username, we do have it because I'm using it to send messages to Discord.
Cool. So immediately that tells me that we need to make API call to get more author. And
could we reach the how's it called, the maximum number of API calls that you can make in a limit of time? Because if this API call is made for every note, that's going to be a lot.
So it's not every note, because it's only wider community members. That being said, you know, there's still going to be reasonable volumes.
Yeah.
I believe my team have maybe already done some analysis on this, and it's roughly 3,000 unique authors per month. I don't know how many notes that translates into. You know, I can reasonably see that one author could author 10, 20, 30, you know, maybe even 100 notes in a month. But I think if you average it out, there will be a number who will kind of maybe create an issue themselves and then respond to a few questions on their issue, or create a merge request and have some sort of back and forth on the merge request. So, you know, I don't think, I don't think we will, but it's a really good point, and I think we should definitely kind of capture that at this point. And yeah, think about how it's good, isn't it?
Well,
but yeah, so first thing is, I think we're going to be making an API call to the GitLab API. So we probably want to use an async job and the Common Room API too. So I can never remember exactly how triage-ops is architected, whether this happens synchronously, and until this is finished, the webhook doesn't actually complete, or if the web, go on, if you know the answer, please.
I think so, because the standard webhook procedure, let's call it that way, is to return as soon as possible.
Yeah.
To know whether the webhook succeeded or not. So,
but do you know, do we like, I don't even know what it's called. I know, is it like handler? So is this what receives the webhook, or?
I think so.
I'm not sure. Like, there may be a good reason why we don't do it, but like if I was, and obviously this is really old now, triage-ops has been around for a long time, but if I was architecting this today, I would probably have this kind of capture the payload, respond immediately, and then asynchronously process.
Maybe that's what it does.
That's what, yeah, I'm a bit unsure. So maybe we need to check check that that's how it works already. But I don't know.
There's actually another thing that we could put in place to avoid making too many API calls to be allowed, like keep a local cache of user data.
Yeah.
Because that data isn't going to change every day.
Yeah, so I guess there's going to be, I wish I could be more scientific about this, but I'm not about to try and start running the numbers. But there's going to be a reasonable amount of, someone making multiple comments in a day. So to avoid having to go and grab that author's details from the API a second time would be really helpful.
Yeah.
Especially also, go on.
Yeah, for example, when you go back and forth on an MR and you leave
exactly
10 nodes at the same time.
Yeah. No, that's a really a perfect example.
Yeah, and since you know that,
and I think it's going to be quite cheap, if that's the right word, to cache like up to a few hundred user author details.
That's what I was thinking about. The only downside of the cache is the memory footprint, let's call it that way. But I mean, we're not storing that much data for each user. We can even try to calculate how much memory it would take to store 100 or 1,000 user data. Wouldn't be that much, I think.
Awesome. So yeah, we probably want an async job, but again, we can tackle that as and when. We're going to need an API call, I think, to get the author info. So I'm almost not fussed by what that author info is at the moment. Worry about that in a minute. So we've got the author info. So we can send the author. We then, so again, so this is interesting. So one of the challenges, forgive me for going off on a slight tangent, but I think it's worth a brief discussion.
Yeah.
One of the current challenges, we don't know in GitLab which users are in Common Room. And we don't really have, I think, a simple, easy, suitable way. We can't update the users in any way, shape, or form. We would need to be an admin on gitlab.com to be able to kind of admin the users and sort of store some data against the user to say this user is in Common Room. So similar to, we just said we're going to need an API call to grab the author information from GitLab. At the moment, my scheduled script that runs maybe twice a day, if it finds a new issue or a new merge request, it will just send the create or update API call to Common Room. So this seems okay for issues and merge requests, because, you know, I don't think we're going to get the same person creating, yeah, they might create a couple of issues, a couple of merge requests, but this runs in a day, sort of batches it all up. So it's only going to kind of make one API call to create the author.
Yeah.
If we're doing this real time, and like you say, someone's commenting on a 5 comments feedback on a merge request, so we could keep a local cache. We almost know that if someone's in this local cache, then we don't need to, maybe we don't even need to cache all the information about the author. We only need to cache the fact that we've already integrated them.
Yep.
Maybe we don't.
Actually, managing the cache will be interesting due to
how do you mean?
I'm thinking about 10 requests getting there pretty much at the same time, but you make an API, so you don't have the entry on the cache, so you make 2 calls at the same time, almost the same time, because the other one hasn't arrived yet, the response, so you don't know the data, so you make 2 calls at the same time and then write on the cache.
So my answer to that is, I don't know if we have this in triage-ops, but maybe a worker is better than an ACE. So every time a webhook fires, it then queues, like adds to a queue.
Yeah.
And then, or not every time it fires, sorry, but when it fires, it hits this checks whether it's applicable, and then adds it to the queue, and then a worker, you know, every 5 minutes or however often, then processes that queue. And that way you've only got a single worker ever processing the queue, and there's no kind of challenge of multiple integrations happening at the same time, and maybe both of them are creating the same author, or
yeah, I don't think that's in place on triage-ops, because I guess that would need sidekick and stuff like that.
But then if you think about it, there's the question about how do the jobs, how are the jobs like handled anyway? Because there must be some background thing that when you say perform a job in 5 minutes, there must be something that then speeds that job up in 5 minutes.
It's actually true. You did that on to leave a comment on the MR ready. You can have a look at that when
but that's what I'm kind of getting at. The difference with that is that runs, so if you had 5 triggers, then that would spin up 5 async, each would happen 5 minutes after. We'll have a look in a second. It might be obvious, it might sort of explain how they work, and there might be an option to say only allow one to run in parallel, and only allow one to run every 5 minutes. So yeah, you're right. Let's have a look. So they're going to be in jobs.
No, it's actually on the processors, the command MR request review.
Yeah, but that then kicks off the job.
Add command job. Yeah, that was what I was interested into having a look.
So there's nothing in this one, but let's just have a flick through all of them to see if there's anything that sort of says, you know, don't run in parallel, or there's no kind of, I don't know, DSLE type. Keep cache warm job. So where is this? Cache immediately. There you go. Perfect. That's exactly what we want, right? So config RU kicks it off. Some kind of worker asynchronously runs every, how often is this one? Every 60 minutes, this one potentially. So, oh no, that's not, ignore that, but whatever. And then, yeah, the job itself actually spawns a new job like every time. I see a slight danger of something explodes and you lose like everything that you haven't processed, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So let me just, my great way of keeping notes. So I've used IIS terminology, but I don't know in Rails world, like, you know, would it be when there's a deployment, or is there like a daily, or does at some point is the application almost kind of destroyed and recreated?
Yeah. That's a nice question.
And if it is, again, I'm guessing that whatever's in the queue will be lost.
Mm-mm.
Okay, lots of questions. So what's really interesting is one of the things that I had in mind before I started thinking about the triage-ops all along is, you know, I was thinking of some kind of like persistent storage, you know, a Postgres database or something along those lines. So I'm definitely going to kind of, when we've got all these questions, take it a bit further.
Yeah, maybe even having a Redis database.
Do you know much about? I know nothing about.
Sorry?
Do you know anything? I don't know anything about Redis. Do you know?
I had a quick look, and I know that's basically a database that speed ups. You can use it to spin up queries, but I think you can also use it as a local quick database. But we still need to have basically we have to persist that somewhere.
Yeah, so that's how I understood Redis, is almost like it's so in the GitLab monolith, it's that layer between the database and the sort of, I don't know, front end, back end, whatever you call it. So like you say, it caches queries, etc.
Yeah.
So if that's still not persistent, like I honestly think that the size of the cache we're thinking about creating, like I think just caching it the current way things are cached in triage-ops is fine.
Yes.
It's just the persistent bit that I'm kind of concerned about at the moment. So, and I don't think great if we've got any ideas, but I actually think, you know, I'm not going to stress too much. I think getting some comments, like even if it was a bit flaky, the first iteration would be better than none.
Absolutely.
And like, it might be that actually spinning up a sort of Postgres database or something would be quite simple, quite easy. I don't.
Well, that might be even the case, because I'm not really sure how the triage-ops infrastructure is, but if that's managed by Kubernetes, and I think that is.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, adding a storage thingy to keep the database and setting up a pod with a Postgres database, I don't think that would be that difficult. Also because it would be basically a very small database with very small amount of data.
Yeah. I think you're right. The biggest challenge is I don't know how many people, like I barely understand the architecture and infrastructure, and I don't know how many people on it's the engineering productivity team that's responsible that own it. Even on their team, how many people kind of have that level of knowledge, and then it's finding the Venn diagram with people that then know how to do what we need to do to spin up a Postgres database, to configure authentication, to configure access, to all the things that we've got to do. We've then got to come up with a schema for that database, and I don't know if things like, I'm more of a Microsoft person, you have like log backups and transaction logs and maintenance jobs, and like it just becomes a bit of a what we need, such a simple requirement. Like,
to be honest, simplest database that database is not a database.
Google Sheets.
Sorry?
Google Sheets.
No, I wasn't thinking about that, but a simple JSON file.
Yes. So we need persistent storage, right? It doesn't matter what, although saying that, yeah, because when we write to it, that's the problem of concurrent.
Yeah, that's the only thing that the database would be more beneficial. Because the thing is, we wouldn't even need. No, we need persistent storage, because even if I was thinking about spinning up a pod with the Postgres database and not having the
volume mounted in some sort of persistent.
Yeah, exactly. Keeping it local to the pod. The issue is that if the Postgres pod goes down, you lose the data.
So an interesting solution that I have created to this problem before, not wanting to have to spin up a database, but wanting persistent and concurrent, I just use a separate file for each record. So if you imagine that what we want is a list of usernames, GitLab usernames, and that's all we really need. And we want to be able to concurrently add usernames, but not concurrently remove them. So what I think we could do is just create a file with the username. It doesn't even have to have any content, just create the file in a folder like persistent storage, and then the worker that processes just gets a directory listing and just works through and deletes each file as it's processed that record.
Yeah, the only
we could even persist and never delete them, because then we would know that all of those records already exist in Common Room.
Yes, that would live at least as long as triage-ops lives.
In theory, yeah. And I think, I mean, I'm not that, I don't Kubernetes, etc. But could you even like mount an S3 bucket or something like that rather than?
I think so.
Or it's GCP, not AWS. So I guess GCP have got their equivalent of storage. So
Yeah, but I think that you can do that. But the only thing that I dislike about using files, separate files even,
yeah,
is that if you have two requests basically at the same time, would create the file like even if you have a check to make sure the file exists, no, okay, let's create it. When between the check and the file actually getting created, you could get another request that makes the same check and creates the same file.
I don't think it's a problem in Ruby world. I could be wrong, but if you use touch, then it doesn't care if the file's there. It like creates it. If the file's not there, then it.
Yeah, but you still need to check whether the file is there or not to
Yes.
decide
Okay.
to make
So
the API call.
yeah. So okay. I'm currently sort of blending two different worlds together here. Let me just finish this scribble quickly.
Yeah.
So yes, we've got two different. So we've got the world where we create the file and delete the file when it's processed. We've got the world where we create the file and keep the file.
Yeah.
Because we want to know that it's already been processed and we don't need to process it again.
Yeah.
So let me just say so if we keep the file, first of all, we've got to be able to do so. If the file is created when the initial hook comes in,
Yeah.
then how do we know once? Do we modify the file content to say it's been processed? Yeah, that would work, wouldn't it?
Yeah, we could save the results if we have to know something about the user. That could actually be the cache for the user data.
Yeah, yeah, we could modify.
And to be honest, even if we get 5 requests nearly at the same time and we fire 5 API calls, because those API calls didn't find the file, so they send the API.
No. I don't think that can happen. In my theory is the file is created synchronous. Is that the right word? Synchronous? Yeah, sort of. When the webhook comes in, so we don't make any API calls then, but then our worker is running once every 5 minutes. So it's never going to run 7 instances at the same time. So that's going to process one file at a time. And the only danger I can see is that exactly at the time that it's processing one of Bob's earlier comments and it reads Bob's file, it sees that Bob's file isn't marked as complete. So it then makes the API call, creates Bob in Common Room, tries to then update Bob's file at the same time as maybe another webhook's firing and trying to write to that file. But I don't see that as, so once processed. I'm actually thinking as well, like maybe we even put a timestamp in the file, and that's how we know that it's been processed. And if that timestamp is like older than a month or something, then we would actually re-interface the user in case they've changed any of their details.
Yeah. Oh, I know what we could do, and it would be easy. If we don't use something complicated like Postgres or Redis or stuff like that, and we simply use SQLite.
Okay.
That's basically a file for the database. That's it. And that would handle the concurrency.
Okay.
So we don't have to worry about that. And we can keep that SQLite
Persistent storage.
persistent. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Definitely, it feels like we may have over-engineered something here. So yeah, I think you're right. There's probably a really simple solution for our very simple problem. Cool. Okay, so we've got the author when the webhook came in. We've stuck that in a database. It's going to be processed by a worker. We know we're going to have to make an API call if we haven't already integrated that author. We're going to make the API call to get the author's data to integrate the author before we then integrate. So the next thing or things.
Because another thing that we have to store is not only the user data. If we make an asynchronous call, or rather, if we process all the nodes asynchronously, we have to keep track of what the user did. So not only we have to know the user data, but we also have to know, okay, the user is this, but what did he do? He posted a note on this issue with this body and that stuff.
Yes, you're right. So we need a table of the actual comments or notes, and it's like, okay, this was the issuable ID or whatever. This was the note, and this was the author. We then process that to determine which. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, because we cannot use the local cache. Otherwise, we go back to the pot goes down, we lose the stuff.
Yeah. Like notes. Yeah, maybe like project ID. Yes. Yeah, then I've been
Do we need the issues and merge requests?
So yes, because I think so. I think we want the issues and the merge requests in common room. I think we do. I don't think it makes sense to have a comment or a note without some context, like labels, for example. Like are people commenting on features or bugs, or that information is really important.
Yeah.
And again, I don't think we need to store. We've got a really tricky one.
But cannot issues and merge requests like How can we do that? Because you need in common room to know, okay, the user commented this on this issue. So you have to know the issue as well.
Yeah.
And the issue on common room is added, like when you process a node, you check whether the issue already exists in common room and create it. If not,
I feel like the operation is almost going to be as expensive to, like, what I'm doing at the moment with this is a kind of, so okay, I'm doing add activity, but it's got a primary key, and the primary key I think is made up of the activity type. So, you know, created ticket, made merge request, or merged merge request, and the ID. So it basically creates a primary key, and if I send this activity a second time, then if it already exists, it'll just update it. So it's almost like, well, if I've got to send an API call to find out whether it already exists, I may as well just send the data, unless there's a lot of overhead in kind of collecting and collating that data.
yeah. But why do you also send things like the title and okay, maybe the title, okay, but the description?
Again, like there's keywords. So like, you know, we want to see people that are talking about AI, or we want to see people that are talking about time tracking. Like,
Okay.
yeah, that there's, you know, there's not a lot there when you look at it. You know, the ID is just to be able to link the records. The date stamp, obvious. The title and description is to get that context, to be able to group search. And then labels, again, we're just grabbing the group and the type label, so we know, is it feature, is it maintenance, is it a bug, and yeah, which group does it belong to, and then yeah, the URL to quickly link to it. So we're not grabbing a lot of info, but yeah, I am a little bit unsure, like, because when we get the hook in, I think we've got all of this information for the issue or the merge request. So we need to somehow pass that to the worker, and the only way I can think of passing it is by putting it all in here. But at the same time, once we've processed it, we almost don't need it afterwards anyway. But we probably do need, like, description. It's similar.
Can you hear the cat from?
No, I can't. Yeah, okay. So the only one that we don't actually need to store the information is the one that we don't get the information in the webhook. So we need to make an API call for it anyway.
Yeah.
Almost doesn't need to be a date. It could just be a flag, but it's as easy to store a date, and then you get some more useful information, I guess. So yeah, when the hook comes in, we get all of this information.
Yep.
So we can populate, although we'll already know we can check, like, I don't know if there's a, what do they call it, like in upsert, that's it. We could use upsert potentially for these records. We don't really care. Oh no, we do. Yeah, so we do need to know. So yeah, the hook comes in, we push all of this in to the SQLite database into the three tables. The worker runs, picks up the first entry from this table, the relevant issue or merge request from that table.
Yep.
Checks whether the author is already in here. If they are, checks to process that and decides whether or not it needs to reintegrate them or not.
Yeah, if that's too old.
Yeah. So then it's either integrated it or not bothered. Then checks to process that on these. If it's null or too old, then reintegrates them.
Yeah.
If not, doesn't bother. And then it comes to this one, it's already only picked ones that haven't already been processed. So then integrates it and then flags it as processed.
Yep.
Cool. I'm sure what we've described is like the simplest like application interface engine, whatever you want to call it, and such a standard thing. But
Probably.
I think it's sort of shoehorning it into triage-ops at the same time as, you know, connecting it to Common Room and, you know, needing some data via the GitLab API as well. So that's my only small concern, whether anyone might start to sort of push back and say, you know, maybe this shouldn't be in triage-ops, but then we, like I say, need our own infrastructure and yada yada.
Yeah, but if the SQLite thing works, I mean, it's just one.
Could be handy for other stuff in triage-ops, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Like even the cache for the team data and stuff like that, that you don't have to fetch it every time the pod starts. I mean, the team YAML file changes not that often.
No.
And we honestly don't really, we don't even store sensitive data on those tables, so we don't have to worry too much about security.
Yeah, although there is a bit of a crazy push these days for stuff like, you know, even issues can be made confidential like after the fact. So we do have to be a little bit careful.
And how do you handle that? Because that's already a thing.
Yeah, I don't really have an answer at the moment. Because again, potentially anyone could already have sort of exported, saved, screenshotted. bots, crawlers could have already sort of pulled the information, etc. So it's a bit of a moot point, but it's a bit crazy. Like even GitLab users, you know, GitLab users' names are PII, even though, you know, you go to /you and your name is there. Like anyone has to be very careful about how that's stored, where that's stored, when that's stored, because go on.
You can see that because my profile is public.
Yes, if you change your profile tomorrow to private, then obviously, yes, loads of people could have already, like GitLab could have crawled, Google could have crawled it. It could be on the way back machine, it could be like stored in a million places, but you know, GitLab as a company, it shouldn't be, you know, and I as an individual, like, or as a team member at GitLab, I shouldn't have like a file on my computer with your name in it, for example. It's a bit crazy and weird and a pain, but you know, we do need to try and comply with various regulations.
But Common Room isn't public. Like, I can't access the data on
No,
Common.
no. That's like, that's true. Nor, like you say, should this database, but like what you're kind of saying is, you know, we almost don't have to be too careful about some of the information, because technically it's public anyway, so it doesn't matter if it's in a database. But you know, yeah, there's things that.
Yeah, but what I mean is that if, for example, I don't know how to set the storage up, but we don't have to protect that database with super massive security stuff. Like, if the file is accessible only within the private network of
Yes,
that's enough.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I did just have one thought, because obviously this is gonna just grow. So we probably do need something like the worker probably does need to purge anything that's.
Well, we can clean everything that's older than a month or 2 weeks.
Which actually sort of gets around the whole thing that I said, like, about, oh, we can use the timestamp to determine like how old they are, and if we want to reprocess them. If we just purge all the data that's older than a certain date, then
yeah, that's one thing. Like, I have a job that runs every day that cleans up the stuff that has already been processed and it's older than, I don't know, 2 weeks.
Oh, awesome. I sort of thought we would do more coding than we've done, but I realized, you know, and I should have definitely beforehand, like, the amount of things I had in my mind and discussions I've already kind of, oh, should it be standalone? Should it be triage-ops? Does it need a Postgres database? Or, you know, because one of the things I was even thinking is we could use triage-ops to capture the events, send them to a Postgres database or something somewhere, which then are completely separate, you know, just a scheduled pipeline in GitLab could just process those.
Yeah, I thought about scheduling pipelines to process the data as well, but it's not really worth it, I think.
Yeah. Well, again, we brainstormed a lot. We've taken some good notes, so I'll share those with everyone and see what they think of SQLite as a solution.
Yeah, I think that for the database stuff, maybe, well, I'm pretty sure that Remy would be able to answer us.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll put out some more feelers.
Awesome.
Anything quick cues for me or whatever? I realize you've run out of time. I've pretty much run out of time as well, but just in case anything's blocking you or.
I'm having a fun time trying to figure out how to solve n+1 issues on the projects resolver using the full path.
Oh, okay. But did the problem already exist using the IDs or not?
That's one thing that I thought about this morning, and I have to check it out, but I am pretty sure it is.
So you haven't introduced this?
No, because it wasn't using an n+1 check before. I added that to make sure we didn't have any n+1s when searching for full paths, but we basically have n+1s everywhere when searching for projects, because a lot of fields aren't optimized for that. So yeah, I think that my argument will be we already had it.
Yeah, I think that will definitely fly. But I would love to have a session with you at some point, having a look and see. Like, it's a really interesting problem space. And I've attacked it a number of times, some successfully, some not so successfully. And I'd love to get better at sort of, understanding the whole preloads and look aheads and.
Oh, well, this is only the second time that I have to deal with n+1, so I'm pretty much I don't know anything about it, but I'm looking at it with Stan, so
Awesome. Yeah, you're in good hands then, yeah?
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. Okay, cool, brilliant. And I think I might be wrong. No, I can't remember now. I see that someone's unblocked the definitely someone from the EP team. I think some blocked the GitLab, the GraphQL gem in GitLab. Like, we're using a really old version, and there's been an MR up, like using maybe like version 1, and we're now on like the GraphQL gems on like 2.5 or something. So we're like way behind. And yeah, there was an MR up from like maybe a year or two ago to try and upgrade to version 2, but there were some major issues. I then took a look, rebased, tried to attack some of those, and again, it just was a bit beyond my expertise. And then I see somebody's re-picked it up, but they've solved all the problems, and I think it's well on its way to being merged now. So.
Maybe that's going to fix some n+1 stuff. I don't think.
Yeah, I think that'd be wishful thinking, but you never know. Anyway, great to see you as always, Marco. Enjoy the rest of your day, and catch up later in the week.
Yep. Bye.
Bye bye.